Hi, my name is Matthew Fields, and I would like to welcome you all to this presentation over a fairly recent innovation made in the surgical um, OR operative realm. Um, and you can see here that I'm mainly discussing the technological side of the innovation using an O-arm or 3D imaging device designed to give surgeons CAT scan-like images in real time during the surgery. While you can imagine that is a massive development in and of itself, it really allows for a standard of care change limited so far to the spinal procedures. However, as the supply and demand for this product grows, this might end up replacing traditional C-arm or 2D fluoroscopy use in the OR for many procedures. When purchasing an O-arm system, specifically the Medtronic O-arm system shown here, you are not just purchasing the obvious O-looking imaging gantry, but rather the entire interconnected system for a surgical suite. The imaging device works with what is called the Stealth Station Navigation System and the actual operating instruments used by the surgical staff during the procedure. Without getting into extreme detail, essentially, images are acquired, then sent to the stealth station. Once this occurs, an infrared laser with infrared receptors are attached to each surgical utensil, and then the signal is overlaid onto the three-dimensional image acquired by the O-arm. Because of this, surgeons are able to see their screw angulations and how exactly they need to move their hands to get optimal fixation devices into the patient's spinal column. After they place the hardware, another set of images is acquired and put into 3D formatting for the surgeon to look at before anything is closed in the surgery itself, verifying that the correct spots have been targeted by the laser and the fixation device is in place. Of additional note, having a spine table is a huge help when acquiring the system, so if your facility doesn't have one already, like the one you can see here, you might want to get one. The previous standard of care required the use of at least one, maybe two C-arm traditional 2D fluoroscopy units in conjunction with the surgeons, and they would place fixation screws and other fixation devices free-handed using guide pins and essentially trial and error. Now, I know trial and error is not something you want to hear when talking about spinal operations, but previously you were completely at the mercy of the skill of your surgeons. While most spinal surgeons are extremely competent, anyone can have a suboptimal day. Also of note, typically a postoperative CT scan was done to check swelling and pressure on the spinal column, as well as to see if screws were in fact placed optimally and weren't exposed outside of the bone, etc. Now, highlighting the reason that the technology developed with the O-arm is the next bullet point. If the surgeons found something was misplaced and the patient was symptomatic, the patient would usually wind up going back to surgery to fix the last surgery they just had. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't seem like much fun. As previously mentioned, when purchasing the Medtronic O-arm, you're not just purchasing the O gantry, the actual imaging device, you're also purchasing the stealth navigation system, as well as the surgical instruments used in the procedure. Um, the Medtronic O-arm allows for traditional 2D fluoroscopic imaging, as well as the innovation of 3D or CAT scan-like imaging in the operative suite, so in real time. The surgeon can tell if the fixation device is placed correctly before they close up the patient. No post-op CT, cost, or radiation is necessary. Additionally, most patients shouldn't require any additional surgery to correct any errors in a perfect scenario. Fixation device misplacement while using O-arm technology is very low. In fact, most data that has been acquired shows less than a 5% chance of screws being in inaccurate or suboptimal positioning. Now I'm going to list for you some of the technological advantages of the 3D imaging system, specifically the Medtronic O-arm. Um, 3D imaging shows the precise angulations necessary to place the fixation screws through the vertebral pedicles uh, for fusions, specifically. The two systems interact using infrared laser beams, similar to the way a Wii console interacted with the controller, for those of you that have played a Wii. The real-time corrections that can be made are astounding. Because of the aforementioned laser receptors on each operating instrument that gets put into the sterile field for the procedure, um, all of those can be picked up using the 3D imaging overlay that is placed um, on the navigation screen. In other words, if a surgeon moves any of those instruments, he can see then how he needs to move his hands to adjust on that screen right in front of him. Like I said, in real time, in and rather than retrospectively using a post-operative CT scan. Obviously, in healthcare, a big thing we need to talk about when talking about any kind of technology development or procedure is the safety advantages for the patient. Otherwise, it's not really worth it. Um, First and foremost, the patients are under anesthesia and in surgery for less time when utilizing the O-arm system versus the prior standard operating procedure. Um, Also, the fixation device placement, primarily the fixation screws, are immensely more accurate with this system and generally require less screw revision with another procedure. Again, that reoperating cost we're talking about. Um, this technology is relatively new, so there aren't very many studies conducted about the procedure and the systems. However, the ones that have been done have shown unequivocally that outcomes are improved and that if you do a relatively large amount of these procedures from a business perspective, this system can pay for itself. As mentioned on the previous screen, reoperation is very limited, and the traditionally warranted post-op CT is not required when utilizing this technology. Now, the reason I keep bringing this up is that there are overwhelming advantages for the patient. Not only does it save them expense, but it also saves them so much when it comes to radiation exposure. They are getting less imaging overall, so less time in radiation. Also, one study was able to measure the average dose of a postoperative CT of the spine um, and the dose of the Medtronic O-arm in the operating room and found that it was about half the dose to the patient. That's huge when we're talking about radiation exposure, especially accumulating it over time, as people with that are getting spinal surgeries have probably had extensive imaging prior and have had probably more chronic back pain requiring sets of images earlier in their life. I don't want to completely bore you with the numbers and statistics, but I think it is important to show you some of them. Now, the test groups utilize the computer assisted spine surgery, which is the O-arm system, the 3D imaging. And the control group utilized conventional 2D fluoroscopy or a C-arm for reference on these numbers. You can see plainly enough that the O-arm uh, was you when the O-arm was used, accuracy went way up, and when that happens, operating time goes way down, radiation exposure goes down, reoperation costs go down for both the patient and the facility, and most importantly, all uh, of the patients had their outcomes increased based upon these numbers. I don't know about you, but I would take 97%, 97.5%, 95.2% any day. Less than a 5% inaccuracy rate, take that to the bank. Now we can talk about the advantages for staff. We don't want to forget about them. Performing these in operations because their safety and comfort comes into play when operating on a patient. The aforementioned studies have shown less need for repeat radiation exposures to surgical team as well as the radiologic technologists like myself. Uh, when it comes to radiation exposure, time under radiation and distance from the source are the key factors when determining exposure. Exposure is reduced when this equipment is being used because less imaging is being done, and when it is being done, surgical staff can leave the room. They can leave the operating room during the imaging process, and the technologist doing the imaging can be at least 6 feet away, making the exposure considerably limited or safe. Another advantage is that the surgical team doesn't have to wear lead aprons that are often cumbersome, hot, and heavy. The only persons needing to wear lead generally would be the anesthesiologist if they felt the need to stay in the room during the exposure, and the x-ray tech. Even at that, they would only need to wear that lead during the exposure processes, which are minimal using the arm, usually one before and one after. Now that we've talked about the advantages for the staff, patients, etc., we can begin to talk about the economic or business side of purchasing this equipment. Now, other systems have been developed using 3D imaging. However, they're usually less comprehensive than the Medtronic O-arm, and the Medtronic O-arm has um, a feature on the gantry that allows it to come in around the patient versus come from the head and down. It can actually open and close around the patient. So those things, in conjunction with the stealth navigation system and the instrumentation, has really put Medtronic O-arm at the forefront of the market on this. Um, so when you've got one company producing the piece of equipment that everybody wants, obviously supply is going to be low, especially since it's a relatively new development. So there's not a lot in stock. So that further decreases the supply, which in turn also drives up cost and demand. Now we learned from the previous slide that supply is low, and the Medtronic O-arm and its integrated systems are dominating the market currently. So demand is very high as well as cost. The intraoperative 3D imaging accounted for 70% of the CT demand overall in 2017. That is a huge market share, and most projections show similar market share through the year 2022. Um, that's quite a run. And also of note, the compound annual growth rate over that time span is 6% increase yearly. Um, so it is certainly being predicted to be the wave of the future. Since it is such a recent development, there are not many that you can find to purchase used or through a third-party vendor. Predominantly, it's going to be a new purchase from Medtronic, or if you go with another 3D imaging device through another company. You can lease this equipment, but that brings in a few more strings that are attached that can cut into your profit margins. So upfront costs for this machine range from roughly 900,000 for the entire Medtronic O-arm system, the O-arm, the stealth station, the instrumentation, to quotes as high as 1.3 million. Um, there are some maintenance costs down the road. They're going to be yearly, and that's really where they get you. They'll get you for a service contract. Not too many estimations out there on the service contracts yet, but they would be fairly substantial. Right now, Medtronic can really set their price without purchasing power of an organization really coming into play. Medtronic can leverage, where it wants to, but really they can set their own price for the next few years at least until the competition catches up. For the purposes of this slide, the cost utility analysis will mainly be discussed in reoperative costs, and the ICER. But you can't leave out the potential cost savings on from lawsuits avoided either. This is not easily quantifiable, but is understood to most likely be a substantial amount given current malpractice laws nationally. When discussing the business advantages of this equipment, it is highly dependent upon the organizational research that has been done as far as available patient pool, surgical staff effectiveness, and the number of surgeons and their willingness to do procedures. Um, all of these factors determine the organization's estimate on per-year patient numbers in conjunction with length of stay and other diagnosis-relatable groups within the organization. Um, if the organization can do several of these cases per week using this equipment, it can not only pay for itself, but you can start making money relatively quickly within a few years. On this next slide here, you can see that you know, those estimates again, 900,000 to a little over 1 million, depending on location and year. It's going to be a large capital purchase with significant upfront costs, so all this stuff must be considered. I was able to actually find where a hospital broke down all their estimations and the purchasing agreement and posted it online. Central Peninsula Hospital in Alaska is the organization that published all this online, as well as their estimates on patients per year, DRGs, and what they estimated they could bill for their services pertaining to spinal surgeries utilizing the Medtronic O-arm back in 2010. This is an invaluable resource as most facilities choose not to show this much transparency. And they based all this on an estimation of 169 spinal surgeries per year. That's a they found that they were going to show a sizable return on investment. Um, Next, I'm showing on this slide that Central Peninsula Hospital's projections and estimations based on 169 cases per year and what they thought they could bill and receive payment for. Important to note here that these numbers aren't just based on operation costs itself, but downstream revenues like length of stay and other aftercare that presumably is done at the facility as well if it is being done right. Not sure if these numbers are realistic, but even if you cut these numbers in half, given the current financial climate facilities are operating in, clearly this equipment is worth it over the long haul. You see 340% return on investment. That's definitely there for shock factor. But again, almost $5 million in net revenue, and just under $30,000 worth of average net revenue per case. Any hospital is going to run away with those numbers from a single revenue stream. They would take that any day. In summation here, if a facility has the capital to purchase the O-arm system and infrastructure in place to handle high volume of spinal cases per year, the financial benefits are there, as you can see, to make money within 1 to 3 years, roughly. Not to mention the possible changing of a standard of care in the practice of spinal surgeries. If you're on the cutting edge, patients are going to want to come to your facility, and that's something you can advertise and tout. So this really can be a game changer for an organization with again, like I say, infrastructure in place and the patient pool there. These are just some of the terms of note used in this presentation. Some of you may know what all the terms were, some of you may not. If you have any questions, I can further their explanations if you need me to. As I previously stated on the other slide, if you need further explanation on any of these terms, you can ask me. I can further explain them. but these are just some of the key ones to this presentation. These next two slides are just a list of the many valuable references that I use to piece together this information. You can do further research if you would like. Certainly some good articles out there that I used. I would like to thank you for your time, and hopefully your organizations or boards would approve the purchase of this groundbreaking technology to aid the best possible outcomes for your prospective patients, because it really can be a game changer. Thank you very much.